This is Western civilization. We're talking about the very beginning of Western civilization. And the actual civilizations we're speaking about actually aren't even, well, first of all, when we talk about Western civilization, what do you usually think about?
Europe.
Europe. But actually the first civilizations that we're studying now aren't even in Europe. They're actually in what you'd call the Middle East. The Mesopotamia, present-day Iraq, along the Mediterranean coast, Israel, Judea, and even into northern Africa, such as Egypt. Does anybody have any idea why we're focusing so much on the Middle East for a basically history of Europe class to begin with?
Because that's where everything came from?
Well, it's kind of where everything came from. There were people up in Europe and even in Northern Europe at this time. But if you're talking about 6,000 years ago or so, you really are talking about kind of the end of an ice age in Europe. And while there were people there, they were kind of the hunting-gathering sort that were really just trying to survive. And speaking of civilization, there are certain ingredients that you have to have before you can call yourself a civilization. For instance, there must be a stable food supply. What is the best way to get a stable food supply? If you're hunting and gathering and hunting animals and trying to gather berries to eat, would that be a stable food supply?
No.
No. So what's the best way to get a stable food supply?
Farm.
Farming. Absolutely. So when you're looking at these early civilizations, these were farmers, okay? And once you have a stable food supply, you can support a much larger population. So a large population, when you talk about these ancient civilizations, may be anywhere from 2,000 to upwards of 100,000, depending upon the area. You also have to have a stable, quote unquote, big government. What would a big government have to do?
Protect the people.
Yes, they were after protection. They were after some type of social structure, but all these armies and stuff like that need something to support them. What do you support?
Money.
Money. And they would have some form of tax. Now, initially, this tax would have been more like a sharecropping system. They would have gotten a certain share of the crops, perhaps. Perhaps they would have got a certain share of any animals that they had. And eventually, as money and all that developed, they would have, of course, paid taxes in that way. You also have to have specialized labor. Now, what do I mean? Exactly, what do I mean by specialized labor, Rachel?
Like skilled artists.
Yeah, you would have skilled people. Basically, if you're talking about what some of these people would have called barbarians, a barbarian is a hunter-gatherer. Basically, everybody is pit for survival. To survive, everybody is basically out there looking for food. Once you have a surplus of food, then not everybody has to be out hunting and gathering. That enables certain people to specialize in labor. In these early societies, you would have had most people farming. But you also would have had kind of this rising middle class that may have been potters. They may have been goldsmiths, silversmiths, blacksmiths. You would have had people who would have been weavers making cloth. So tanners, the tan skin. So you start having more specialized labor. And finally, you've got to have a form of writing. Why would writing be so important?
Well, for the merchants and stuff.
The merchants and stuff, okay, they want to keep records. The writing probably would have been originally used for the government to keep records on. They want to know how much money you owe them or what portion of crop you owe them, right? And secondly, for your merchant and specialized labor class to have had kept records too. They want to know how much they owe, kind of accounting purposes, really. So the very beginning of writing was basically a necessity. You need to know, the government needed to know who owed them what and what they own, and the merchants and the business people also needed to keep records. Well, the first civilization we're talking about is Mesopotamia. And Mesopotamia literally means the land between the rivers. And by rivers, we mean the Tigris and the Euphrates. Does anybody know someone who is from this area of Mesopotamia?
Abraham?
Abraham, father of the Hebrew people. He was from the ancient city of Ur, which is kind of in the southern border of Mesopotamia. And Mesopotamia, as well as the civilizations of ancient Egypt, even if you go along the same time, the Indus River Valley in India, and over to the Ganges River Valley in India, and even all the way over into ancient China, these were all fluvial civilizations. They were a fluvial world, and that means they were river-centered. What do you know about the geography of the Middle East that would make it so necessary to be river-centered?
It's desert.
It is desert. I will say that they believe it was a little bit wetter back then than it is now. A lot of these civilizations, popping up in this area of the world, it was really kind of the more temperate area of the world at the time. And they do believe it was a little bit wetter than it is now. It probably wasn't like a swamp or anything like that, but they do believe the weather was a little bit wetter than it is now. Also, they believe it may have been a tad cooler with the glaciers and all that further north into Europe and all that were receding. But so they had the land between rivers. It was a fluvial world. It was definitely river-centered. Interestingly enough, when you're talking about the time when Mesopotamia was in its heyday, it is believed that people further north in Europe were kind of living in grass huts and basically still hunters and gatherers. But if you go up here to the first main group in Mesopotamia were the Sumerians. And the Sumerians would have been the society that Abraham was from. This would have been the society that Abraham grew up in. And the first thing about Sumerians is they were basically a series of city-states. That means there were no great empires with the ancient Sumerians. They're just a series of city-states. We said Abraham was from one of these city-states by the name of Ur. These city-states had certain beliefs, but their main belief was the fact that first of all, the Sumerians, what type of religion did they have?
Polytheistic.
They were polytheistic. They believed in many gods. And in the Sumerian belief, that basically all the land belonged to whatever their main city god was. They recognized the other lesser gods too, but all these city-states would have kind of had a main god that they believed owned the city and all the land around it. And the kings and rulers of these cities would have kind of divided up the territory, usually to people that supported his rule. But it was still an idea that all the land around them belonged to their gods. They were very distrustful of one another. Some of these city-states were actually fairly close together. You know, not much more than a day or so journey. But they were very distrustful of one another. They often quarreled among each other. They did not get along very well. Even in times of crisis, they were unable to get together. And that is the biggest reason why these city-states, one by one, fell to what the Sumerians termed barbarians. And basically, They considered a barbarian anybody who wasn't like them, didn't have the civilized lifestyle of cities and farming. First of all, the Sumerians, however, were quite prolific builders. They would build gigantic temple-like structures called ziggurats, many, many, many stories high. What does that kind of remind you of?
The Tower of Babel.
Tower of Babel, yes. So apparently they were kind of in competition with each other as who could have the highest ziggurat or the highest temple. Now, they had a certain manner of building. Okay. There were, particularly, you're talking about 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, you know, they did have what you would call wooded valleys along the river fronts. There were trees there. But as you point out, most of that land now was desert, and at this time it would have probably been kind of more like dry grassland, savanna land. They didn't have an overabundance of trees, is what I'm trying to come up with, tell you. Does anybody know where the only forested area of the Middle East would have been in ancient times? Lebanon, yes. That is where King Solomon supposedly got some of the trees for his temple. But overall, this is not an overly forested area, even thousands of years ago. But they had to build with what they had. So what was the main thing they had plenty of?
Clay.
Clay, dirt, yes. So these buildings, probably including the Tower of Babel, would have been built out of bricks. Now, we already had said that wood was even at this time, would have been kind of in short supply. So they would not have built all of their buildings out of baked bricks. So to kind of conserve wood and how much they would have to haul and all that kind of stuff, they would have used sun-dried bricks on the inside of their buildings. They would have used baked bricks on the outside. Now, what happens as a house kind of ages and wears and tears? What happens to the outside coating? Even if it was a baked brick originally.
Deteriorates.
Deteriorates, and then what happens after it deteriorates?
It cracks up.
It cracks, and when those winter rains come, what's going to happen?
It'll wash away.
Yeah, that water leakage is going to come in. And so basically having these sun-dyed bricks on the inside over a period of years would have severely compromised the inside structure of the bricks. So these sun-dried bricks would have deteriorated, and eventually what would have happened even to the baked bricks on the outside?
They'd wash away.
Yeah, they would just crumble into each other. So this is kind of an interesting thing. When the Sumerians saw that their structures were being compromised, what would they do? What would anybody do if you thought that you had a house that wasn't safe to live in anymore? What would you do?
Build a new one.
You tear it down and build a new one. And so the interesting thing about these ancient Sumerian cities is they literally built atop the old houses. So what you would do, your house deteriorated, you'd come up there, you'd knock your house down. Bricks were dirt anyway, right? They'd pound them down into a pulp and build a new house on top, and gradually the levels of these cities rose. If you go to some of these sites of these ancient cities now, they almost seem like hillsides out among the plains. But the reason for that is they literally built house atop house atop house atop house. So like I said, a lot of these hillsides are really just the remains of these ancient cities. Of course, like all civilizations, the Sumerians had a form of writing. They called it cuneiform, which literally means wedge-shaped writing. Would everyone have known how to write?
No.
No. Actually, it would probably have been 10% of less of these societies that would have known how to write. Of course, your government officials would have known how to write because obviously they had to keep the tax records for the government, right? The other people who would have known how to write were probably your professional classes. And they also wanted to keep records to make sure they got paid what was owed them. These were done on clay tablets. Like I said, the biggest material they had out there was clay and dirt. So the Sumerians wrote on clay tablets, and many ancient remains of these clay tablets have been found. Of course, clay holds up a lot better than this paper. You know, clay could hold up for, you know, obviously thousands of years. And 99% of these clay tablets they have found have been business related. So these Sumerians definitely didn't have a great literary history because they basically kept things for business purposes. There were some literary writings that remained. Gilgamesh, all those type of things, they do trace back to the society. But like I said, there's not like a whole series of, you know, ancient Sumerian literature because they just weren't into that. They were basically into making money and counting to how much they had. And when I did say money, but basically, even with paying their taxes and all that, the Sumerians really did not have a money system. Money was actually first developed in ancient Lydia, which is in Asia Minor, what we call today Turkey. So they were all based on a barter system. Even paying their taxes would have been based on a barter system. And it kind of came down to sharecropping. When you're talking about what would go into the system and come out. Because of the good records that they kept on all this cuneiform, it seemed that even the kings of the city were supposed to pay a certain amount of taxes into like the general temple fund. Usually it was a measure of grains and things like that. And of course it would be used to support the priests of the city gods. And also there's records that maybe in times of famine or something like that, that it would have been used to feed the people. But they seem to keep very, very diligent records about it to make sure that whatever was taken out was always repaid. And it seemed to be that even the king himself of the Sumerian city-states would also have to repay whatever he had taken out. It wasn't just a free-for-all for him either with the barter system. Now, we talked about how these were definitely polytheistic. And in some ways, they had scores of gods. Of course, each city would have kind of had their own main god, but they would have recognized the gods of their other city-states. But mostly what you can realize about the Sumerian religion is it was pessimistic. What does pessimistic mean? What does I mean when I say pessimistic? What's a pessimistic person like?
They're always looking down.
They always kind of think the worst and all that kind of stuff. The Sumerians really believed that their gods basically hated them and that they had to do all this kind of type of appeasement just to kind of catch a break. They did not definitely have a loving relationship with their gods at all. They thought the gods hated them, that their life was hard because the gods hated them so much, and their religious practice was basically doing different things in order to keep their gods from being mean to them, more or less. And their worship was pessimistic. And instead of being thankful for blessings and things like that, they were basically, their worship was appeasement. What can I offer to the gods so they'll leave me alone? Okay? Very pessimistic. His appeasement is what they basically were doing with their gods. Um, Also, because their gods were they basically did nothing but appease and appease and appease, their gods really didn't have any type of moral authority. And without moral authority, there really wasn't a concept of sin. It's really kind of shocking, that coming from this society, that Abraham would have had the drive that he had. And so, being that there's really nothing in this culture to support it, I would have to say that Abraham's call would have to be the call of God. Because there would have been nothing in his upbringing or his raising or anything else that would have said, flee from sin and go off and you can start a race that's going to be blessed by God. Because they didn't have a concept of being blessed and they didn't have a concept of sin in the society he grew up in. So those were definitely peculiar concepts to the Sumerians. They did believe that the gods owned everything. And since the gods owned all, they had to pay a yearly tithe to use the land. And it's basically for, like I said, back to this concept of appeasement. Because they felt like they were always trying to appease their gods. Interestingly enough, also from some of the ancient writings, and like I said, some of these writings are close to 6,000 years old. They also have a concept of the story of a worldwide flood. Story of a worldwide flood with two of a kind in the boat. What does that sound like?
Noah's flood.
Yeah. Of course, and y'all probably know the answer to this from either Doc's or Dr. Dickerson's class. When was Genesis, Exodus, and all that written? And by whom?
By Moses.
By Moses. Those are books of Moses. So, actually, the stories of a worldwide flood here by the Sumerians is actually many, many centuries older written. That's kind of like the first mention of it. So that's actually the first mention of it. Now, they didn't get along. They were being overtaken by a barbarian. They never were unified as an empire until an extremely powerful barbarian, he was called barbarian too, came in the picture, Hammurabi, and Hammurabi defeated all the city-states. It was finally under a foreign power that all of these city-states were united into one empire. And that was the Babylon of Hammurabi. And this was the Babylonian Empire, the first Babylonian Empire, not to be confused with the second Babylonian Empire, with Cyrus and all them. So this is the first Babylonian Empire. and the capital city was at Babylon. What does it take in order to have a concept of sin?
Laws to break.
Laws to break. Not only that, but you have to have some type of moral authority. Without the moral authority, you don't have the concept of sin. And also, you have like a very, very pessimistic society here. Now we have Hammurabi. And Hammurabi, this would be considered the first Babylonian Empire. And this is not to be confused with the later Babylonian Empire, when during the Babylonian captivity and all that. That was actually a later Babylonian Empire, because those were actually Medes. Of course, if it's the Babylonian Empire, what was the capital?
Babylon.
Babylon. Capital was Babylon. Like I said, this is not the same Babylon of Nebuchadnezzar, or same place, but not the same empire. And there is one main achievement of the Babylonian Empire, or in Hammurabi, other than, of course, unifying these warring city-states. His other achievement was the mere fact that he had the first code of law to be written down. This was the first code of law to be written down. By the way, this Hammurabi takeover of Samaria would have come after Abraham left Ur. So when Abraham left Ur, you still have the series of city-states. Okay, Hammurabi would have come in at a later time, probably while Abraham was still kind of wandering amongst on the outskirts of Canaan, is when Hammurabi would have come in. Hammurabi's code was 1800 BC, and the next codified, written down codes of laws were the Ten Commandments, and that would have been around 1500 BC. So these would have come about 300 years prior to the Ten Commandments. Now, it was called Hammurabi's Code. And Hammurabi wanted all to know his laws. They were literally written on 8-foot tall black stones. And they didn't hide them either. They were literally like in the, kind of like the downtown central square of Babylon. They were later discovered hundreds of miles to the east, where a conquering power had basically drug them off as booty to show off the conquering of Babylon. But they do have many of these 8-foot black tablets. And Hammurabi's code is often thought to be a little bit harsh. Some examples of Hammurabi's code: if you were caught stealing, they would have cut off your hand. If you were accidentally injured someone and caused their death, the death penalty was imposed. I will say that the punishments were unequal. In Hammurabi's code, depending upon whether you were an aristocrat, or you were a middle class, or if you were a common person. The punishment was unequal, and it depended on your social class. Almost for any offense, even like killing noble's farm animal, a slave or a common person would have been killed. Whereas if you had accidentally killed a slave girl, you would have been just required to pay for a replacement for her. So it was unequal, dependent on social class. If you are comparing this to the Ten Commandments, first of all, the Ten Commandments are a lot shorter. There's 10 of them. Over 250 of Hammurabi's codes. And are the Ten Commandments punishments different depending on their social class?
No.
Are the laws different depending upon what social class you're in? No. And a lot of this comes from this. The Sumerians, and I guess kind of Hammurabi kind of adopted this code too because it was to his benefit, kind of looked as their kings as kind of like gods on earth. And they would have felt that since that was their god on earth, that the king would have special privileges, as well as the nobles would have had special privileges. When you're looking at the Ten Commandments here, it didn't see people as being different if they were a king or, earlier it was the judges, simply because that was more, the king was looked more as a servant of God than he was a god himself. And that's a very different worldview. Really and truly, as we look at these ancient civilizations, one of the main things you're going to see is the fact that the Judea, Israel civilization that we'll be looking at later was quite a peculiar people. They were different in many, many respects from these other ancient civilizations. And that's kind of like where the God kind of launched the idea of Christians as being a peculiar people, because their predecessors, the Jews or the Hebrews, definitely were a peculiar people compared to the surrounding civilization. They were odd in many respects. They were odd in many respects.